afternoon. Thanks for coming. So this is Marketcrafting, a 21st Century Industrial Policy. And my name is David Graywall. I'm a professor in the JSP program, Jurisprudence and Social Policy, at the law school, and I'll be moderating today. The event is being presented by the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative, and because that's new but continuous, I wanted to just say a brief word about it so that we're all on the same page. So BASI, it's a recently launched Center for Cross-Disciplinary Research in Political Economy here at UC Berkeley. And BASI works very closely with the Social Science Matrix, which is the place where we're all seated. And we're grateful for their help in hosting today's event, especially Amanda and Eva from BASI and all the Matrix crew. So many of you may be familiar with the Network for a New Political Economy. It was N2PE. We had a nice little acronym. And that ran here at Berkeley for several years. N2PE's key initiatives are now moving into BASI. So if you've already signed up for the N2PE newsletter, you'll notice that the newsletters will start to come to you from BASI. That is not by accident. We'll also be launching the BASI website very soon. I think maybe even gone live this week, hurrah. And so you can follow BASI also on Twitter. The Twitter handle is BASI_Berkeley for those who are on that medium. BASI will be presenting another event a week from today. Let me just get that up here. October 10, Simon Johnson, who's terrific, is speaking on Power and Progress, our 1,000-year struggle over technology and prosperity. He's from MIT. And in a new book co-authored with Darren Acemoglu, Johnson argues that progress depends on the choices we make about technology, and that new ways of organizing production and communication can either serve the narrow interests of an elite or become the foundation for widespread prosperity. And Brad DeLong from the economics department will be the discussant. Looking ahead, October 31st, California Spotlight, from boom to doom in San Francisco. We're getting in on the San Francisco action. And December 5th, Trevor Jackson, who's a new hire between History Department and Political Economy program, will be presenting on his book, Impunity and Capitalism, The Afterlives of European Financial Crises. And I'll actually be a discussant on that book. So anyhow, there's lots to see, and welcome. So our talk today is entitled Marketcrafting, a 21st Century Industrial Policy. And the speaker is Peter Spiegler to my immediate left. Peter is a senior researcher and editorial director at the New Institute of Political Economy in New York. Before that position, he taught economics at University of Massachusetts Amherst and University of Massachusetts Boston, and he has a PhD in economics from Harvard. He's the author of Behind the Model, a constructive critique of economic modeling, and also a co-author along with Chris Hughes of the report entitled Marketcrafting, which came out from the Roosevelt Institute earlier this year. Our discussant will be Steve Vogel, a professor of both political science and political economy here at Berkeley and director of the political economy program. Steve is the author of several books, most importantly for these purposes today, Marketcraft, How Governments Make Markets Work from 2018. So we couldn't be more fortunate in our discussant and in our speaker, nor really in the topic. As many of you know, so while you're here, industrial policy has come back in a big way. What that means, I think, remains to really be settled. There's still an ongoing debate about it in all its dimensions, and how deeply it will be entrenched, how long it will be with us. I'm among those who are rooting for it, and I think, but I think there's lots to be explored about it, about its limits, about its potentials. So I'm really glad that this is the second of two events that BASI has sponsored on this topic already this fall. I really think it's vital that we get cross-disciplinary interest in industrial policy. So with that, I will welcome Peter Spiegler.
There we go. All right. Yes. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to David and to Steve and to Amanda and BASI for inviting me here, and to Eva and Chuck also for help today in getting this organized. I've got the UC Berkeley login page here with little things, so it'll take me a second to get my marks. But I am really pleased to be here. I can't imagine a better place to be talking about marketcraft and marketcrafting and the return of discourse over industrial policy and at Berkeley, Steve Vogel's work obviously has been a major source for Chris and me. This is the report that I'm going to be drawing from today, mostly. As you can tell by the title, it was a major source for us. We were trying to build on his work and apply it to current policies, and his work on Marketcraft really is essential reading for understanding what's happening in U.S. economic policy today. So really happy to be here. So what is happening in U.S. economic policy today? Something is happening. Just in the 2 years from 2021 to 2022, we've seen an enormous outbreak in fiscal policy. These three bills, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the CHIPS and Science Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act, have introduced many hundreds of billions of dollars into the economy. For the Inflation Reduction Act, the tax credits, which were uncapped, are maybe going to eventually put $1 trillion into the economy in that way. So clearly something is happening, and it's not just the policies. On the economic side, we often worry that fiscal policy will crowd out private investment and maybe it won't have any effect on the economy at all. But we're already seeing that there is a significant impact of these policies in the economy. In fact, some crowding in. Some of this has small type, but what you're seeing here is year over year acceleration in factory building since these programs have begun. The blue line is the absolute amount, and the bluish green is the year over year change. And you can see that just at the end of the graph there, we're seeing the highest increase in factory building since the statistics have begun. A lot of this is happening in semiconductors, and effect of the CHIPS Act. A lot of private investment being crowded in. This is a graph showing semiconductor manufacturing equipment. So we've got an enormous boom in manufacturing, in semiconductors, in green energy. The graphs are all sort of looking like this. So something is definitely happening. And interestingly, in the green energy side, in the Inflation Reduction Act, the new spending on manufacturing has been widely dispersed, but really concentrated in places that have been hard hit by the decline in manufacturing. So there's clearly something going on, and it hasn't escaped anybody's notice. Everybody's talking about it. And the question is, what is going on? What does this signal? Is this a return of industrial policy? This is we hear this a lot, but that's what we're seeing, return of industrial policy. Is it something maybe slightly different? Do we not want to call it industrial policy? Maybe supply side liberalism, a liberalism that builds. So I want to talk a little bit today about what these programs represent, and to make the case that taking the perspective of Marketcraft, of economic policy as Marketcraft, really helps us to understand properly what they are, what they mean, and what the prospects are for these kinds of programs. So to set the stage for the discussion and to lay out the stakes, I want to briefly take us back to May of 1980. In the United States, Jimmy Carter was in the White House. Paul Volcker was at the Fed. The 1980 presidential election was just a few months away. Blondie's Call Me was at the top of the Billboard Hot 100, and Dallas was the #1 show on television. In London, on May 21st of that year, Margaret Thatcher was giving a speech to the Conservative Women's Conference at the Royal Festival Hall in London. And she was clear from the outset that she was there that day to deliver some unvarnished truths. The speech begins, "In the Conservative Party, we are proud of our reputation for straight talk and for facing the facts." And one of the important facts that Thatcher wanted the audience to face that day was that it was time for the British government to grow up, that they had been trying to evade market discipline for too long, but in fact, there is no alternative to a market approach to policy, that the proper policy for the British government would be to shrink the state, remove regulation, and let market logic and discipline do its work. The implication of that kind of image of the market and the relationship between the market and the state, the implication of that for these policies today, these Biden policies, would be that policies like this are just an utterly doomed attempt to steer the economy in an unnatural direction. They'll only result in inflation, a bloated public sector, and economic stagnation. And this way of thinking, the thinking that there is no alternative, which was abbreviated by followers as TINA, T-I-N-A, TINA, this became a motto of neoliberalism and the dominant way to think about the relationship between markets and the state in policy circles, not only on the right, but also on the left for many decades. And acceptance, we see an acceptance of the basic framing, this basic framing by Clinton and Blair governments, and both on the right and the left. But this is an unhelpful way to understand the nature of markets and the relationship between states and markets. And thankfully, we've had a lot of helpful literature to help us understand that, some of the most important coming out of this very institution. So what is a better way to understand this? If we're going to try to understand what's going on with the Biden programs, we don't want to start with that framing. We need to apply a couple of correctives so that we can have the proper perspective to understand. So the first corrective is that they're just this clean division between the state and the market is just false. There's no such thing as a perfect free market. Login screen yet. No such thing as a perfect free market in the sense of a market that arises spontaneously between buyers and sellers with no kind of coordinating mechanism and no constraints other than competition. In fact, all markets are and must be created. They require, at the very least, rules regarding property rights, legitimate forms of exchange, and in modern practice, actually existing markets in complex economies require much more than this to function well. And we have a large reservoir of scholarship establishing that markets are and must be joint public-private creations. So this more accurate understanding allows us to see that economic policy in a market economy is not simply a matter of deciding how much the state will intervene in what would otherwise be a free market, as Thatcher's framing would suggest. But rather, economic policy involves the state's participation in shaping the environment in which market interactions take place. And significantly, there's no option for the state not to be involved in creating and shaping markets. So if we want to stick with there is no alternative, we can at least have this first corrective and say there is no alternative to markets as public-private institutional forms. And we need another corrective as well. We need to understand that all economic policy involves the crafting of markets, and market crafting generally affects the distribution of constraints and permissions of market actors and the pattern of benefits and costs arising from their market activity. So in other words, market crafting is inherently political. This is true even of so-called laissez-faire policies that are presented almost as an anti-policy. That is, as the state retreating from markets in order to allow markets to take their natural form. This was the narrative of neoliberal economic policy, but as much recent scholarship has demonstrated clearly, neoliberal policymakers were extremely active market crafters, enacting policies to shield powerful market actors from the constraints of democratic politics, encasing markets to use the term of Quinn Slobodian. So we can apply this second corrective. There is no alternative to markets as artifacts of a political settlement, an ongoing political settlement, but still, each market bears the stamp of a political settlement. So with that, I think maybe a corrected view of what there is no alternative to, we can now properly assess what is turned to assessing what's going on with these new Biden bills. And think first a little bit about what's new and what might not be new. What is not new is market crafting, or market crafting with political consequences. This is something that always goes on and always has. The fact that we see this with these Biden bills is not something new. The size and concentration of these programs is newish. There's definitely something interesting and different going on here that we haven't seen in this concentrated form in a while. But I think that what may be genuinely new is that maybe we are seeing a move to post-neoliberal economic policy making. And I say maybe, what I think may be indicating that we have that move is that these bills may represent the state reclaiming the prerogative to set priorities, even if those priorities are at odds with the priorities of capital in the current neoliberal market configuration. And just as a quick side note, because capital it's a term fraught with controversy and certainly not a homogeneous entity. And just to fix terms, when I say capital, just to be concrete, I'll mean roughly individuals for whom income from capital, that is financial claims, is more important than income from labor. Obviously, that's something we could talk about a lot more, but just want to be clear about a contentious term. So maybe what we're seeing is the state reclaiming the prerogative to set priorities, even if those priorities are at odds with the priorities of capital in the current neoliberal market configuration. But it's too soon to tell yet whether the administration will deliver on this promise. So I say, maybe there's something new happening on that front, but maybe not. And we're going to talk about that as we go along here today. So for the rest of the talk, we'll proceed in this way. I want to say a little bit about Marketcraft and then talk about market crafting policy programs, which is the way I'm referring to what kinds of things the Biden bills are. And then I want to say a bit about assessing these bills, look at some criticisms of the Biden bills, think about some measures that might help to address the criticisms, and then conclude by coming back to this question of, are we seeing something new? Okay, so what is Marketcraft? One of the main lessons from understanding economic policy as Marketcraft is, as mentioned, that there is no such thing as a perfect free market. We can think of all markets in a sense as networks of constraint and permission that are jointly constructed by the state and private actors. So you have constraints and permissions coming from both sides. On the private side, you have constraints coming from competition from other actors. You have constraints coming from possible litigation from other actors. You also have professional and industry regulation or standard setting or codes of conduct. For instance, in finance, you have organizations like FINRA, the Financial Industry Regulation Authority, or FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board. These are not public entities, they're private entities, they're standard setters, even though they interact a lot with public entities. And you also have conventions and norms that govern private actors in markets. On the public side, you have statutory authorities. You have property law, commercial law, contract, labor, finance, tax, and trade law, and regulations, health and safety regulations, environmental regulations. All of these work together to form this network, this public-private network. Marketcraft, we can see as the public side of this, the art of shaping markets using public policy. And obviously, these two sides interact. The nature and degree of competition, for example, is in part determined and shaped by public policy. And public policy is itself shaped by private interventions and involvement in the policymaking process. And then as individuals actually interact in the market, the rules that are set up by the state come into life and actually become living constraints. So there's interaction both ways. We can talk a little bit more concretely about what Marketcraft actually looks like, how it is practiced. The government is involved at all levels of market functioning. At the most basic level, the government's involved in defining market actors and constructing goods. So corporations, for example, are not naturally occurring entities. They're constructions of the state. And property law is essential in defining what counts as a good for purposes of market exchange. The government also shapes production processes, for example, through labor law and health and safety regulations, and also shapes where and how exchange occurs. For example, by establishing market arenas like stock exchanges, promoting competition through antitrust law. And the government can also shape markets through direct participation when it offers a public option for delivery of a good or services, as with, for example, public transportation or public provision of credit. So all economic policy in a market will involve some measure of marketcraft. The major Biden administration programs are no exception to this, but what is notable about them is their programmatic nature. They are what we called in the report market crafting programs. So that is an integrated set of market crafting policies designed to achieve a set of policy goals. And we identified in the report three main components of market crafting programs, which I'm going to talk about in a little more detail now. A mission component, a component consisting of implementation, coordination, and maintenance measures, and then a component consisting of accountability measures. So, missions. The economist Mariana Mazzucato has written extensively about the importance of missions, she among others, but she especially in policymaking, and especially in policy programs that are meant to be transformative. A policy mission is an articulation of the overall goal of the policy program, but it's more than just a political slogan. A well-crafted mission acts as a coordinating mechanism both for policy design and implementation, as well as for political coalition building. To accomplish this, the mission has to be both ambitious and important enough to be inspiring, while also being concrete enough to allow for public accountability. That is, it needs to be concrete enough for the public to assess whether or not it is delivering on its goals. And the concreteness is important. A mission that's too broad and vague is not really a mission. It is instead what Mazzucato calls a grand challenge. Good missions are concretizations of grand challenges. And we can just think about what grand challenges and missions might look like for a few policy challenges that we're facing at the moment. So for semiconductor policy, for example, a grand challenge might be improving the resilience of critical supply chains, but something more concrete, a mission might be reshoring and or friendshoring a certain proportion of the manufacturing of certain types of chips. With respect to housing policy, a grand challenge might be something like easing the burden of housing costs for all Americans. This is something that the Biden administration's housing plan specifically mentions as a broad goal, as a grand challenge. But more concretely, we could say that a mission might be creating 4 million new housing units by 2030. And similarly for energy policy, we might say transitioning to sustainable green energy policy is a grand challenge, but net zero by 2050 would be something more like a real mission. The implementation, coordination, and maintenance component of a policy program is, in a sense, the operational core of the program. This is where policymakers lay out how they plan to achieve the goals of the program, specifically who will do what, where, and when. So the implementation aspect is about matching goals with capabilities. So thinking about what capabilities are available to pursue the specific goals, what kind of statutory authority do we have? What is the institutional capacity that we have? And are there certain norms that are going to constrain us in how we can actually affect this policy? Coordination is going to be particularly important for complex market crafting programs like all of these Biden bills, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And coordination is really about choosing levels and locations of the policy implementation. Should it be at a department? Should it be focused and coordinated at a department level or an agency level? Does there need to be interface with state, local, and international entities? And if you decide that it's at a department or agency level, which department or agency should it be at? Do we have the institutions that we need already, or do we need to build new institutions? These are the kinds of questions that are important on the coordination level. Maintenance measures are about anticipating problems, anticipating things that might undermine the ongoing success of the program. So, for instance, protecting the implementation and coordination apparatus from opposition, thinking about what kinds of coalitions of support you need to build to protect this apparatus. And also, and especially in progressive market crafting programs and in major fiscal spending programs, you need to be concerned about the possibility of inflation that arises as a result of the program. I'm going to have more to say about that at the end. But these are the kinds of concerns that would fall into the category of maintenance issues. And just to give some quick examples of what this looks like in some of the Biden bills, in the CHIPS and Science Act, most of the manufacturing goals are coordinated through the Department of Commerce. Some of that apparatus is going through existing infrastructure, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST. But NIST, the Commerce Department decided to also build a new institution, the CHIPS for America office within the NIST. This is a little bit like snoozy nitty gritty, but just to be concrete about what we're talking about here. The CHIPS for America office is the place where all of the, the grant making is going to go on, the evaluation of the grant programs, and designing the calls for grant applications, actually turning the statutory language into specific requirements in the grants. All of that is happening at CHIPS for America office, which is under Commerce in the NIST. But this is a very complex bill. There are many goals. There are lots of different funding sources, and there are also conditions that the programs require be put on recipients of funds. That involves a lot of different agencies. A good deal of the funding is coming through tax credits, and that's obviously coordinating with the Treasury Department. There are workforce training and development requirements for recipients of grant funds, and those are being developed and assessed by the Department of Labor, Department of Energy, and National Science Foundation jointly. In addition, there are national security considerations because there are provisions in the CHIPS and Science Act to ensure that technology is not making its way to adversarial countries. So that requires coordination with the Defense Department and the Director of National Intelligence. All of this is coordinated by through Commerce, but there's a lot that needs to be worried about in the design, making sure that all of these parts are going to work together. In terms of maintenance, the CHIPS and Science Act, like the Inflation Reduction Act, is supposed to be in part its own defense against inflationary problems that might result. One of the main purposes of the CHIPS and Science Act was to try to make the semiconductor supply chain more resilient, less prone to unexpected bottlenecks. And so in a way, it by design, it deals with its own, or is meant to defend against possible negative effects of inflation. And just very quickly, I won't go through all of this, but the Inflation Reduction Act has a lot of similar issues with funding coming from various places and dealing with different departments. But one thing I did want to mention was just in the maintenance. Oh, sorry, I'm looking at that, but you're not. In the maintenance part of this, one interesting provision in the Inflation Reduction Act that I would put in the maintenance category, something that's sort of guarding against opposition that might come up along the way, is that there are measures to promote geographically broad siting of projects with an emphasis on economically distressed communities, or what they're calling traditional energy communities in the program. And that is communities that had benefited from or that had been part of the fossil fuel economy that are really going to be hard hit by the green energy transition. And it was a deliberate design choice to make sure that some of these things were cited in those areas, in part because that's a good thing to do, but also in part anticipating, you need to maintain a coalition of support for this, and you don't want to engender a lot of opposition from places that are going to be negatively affected. So an interesting provision on the maintenance side in the Inflation Reduction Act. The final component in these programs is the accountability component. And in general, accountability measures are measures to ensure that the policies are working to achieve the program's overall goals, or at least not undermining them. And I'll have a little more to say about what that means. But this accountability measures can be part of any market crafting program. In some ways, it's just good practice, thinking ahead and trying to find ways that you can assess whether things are going well. But there is an important difference in market crafting programs that are working with versus working against existing market configurations. And let me give an example of what I mean by that. So suppose that you have a policy goal of ensuring adequate credit generally, adequate liquidity within the economy to provide a credit generally. If that is a policy goal, the Federal Reserve lowering their target policy rate is one way to achieve that. And the current market configuration is set up to translate that policy move into additional liquidity. And the market that does that, the financial markets that do that, this is not a free market by any means. These were highly engineered markets to make sure that that kind of outcome would happen. If, on the other hand, you wanted to not only ensure that there's adequate liquidity generally, but you wanted to make sure that increases in liquidity would be made available specifically to certain kinds of activities, let's say to support the green energy transition, but maybe not to support the fossil fuel, the fossil fuel economy. That kind of credit allocation is something that our system is not as easily set up to do through Fed policies. The Fed does not take part in credit allocation like that. If you wanted to have a policy that was increasing credit liquidity in the economy, but you wanted to steer it, you wanted to make sure that it wasn't steered in directions that were adverse or that were not in the direction of your policy goals, that would require additional measures. You would need to do more work to figure out what kinds of things do we have to design to do that, and it would be a difficult problem because the Fed doesn't currently have the authority to do things like that, at least not explicitly. So when I talk about accountability measures to ensure that the policies are working to achieve programs' overall goals, or at least not undermining them, you have to think about things like this. What is the current market configuration? How will resources flow through this market? And if we're trying to enact policy through this market, do we have some goals that are at odds with the way that this market will tend to make these resources flow? And for progressive market crafting policies like these Biden bills, this is going to be a major concern because the current market configurations, broadly speaking, are products of decades of neoliberal market crafting. So progressive market crafting programs will generally be pushing against the tide, and as such, they'll require more robust accountability mechanisms. So in particular, a few kinds of things that progressive policy programs need to be cognizant of and guarding against would be unjust appropriation of benefits by powerful groups, or capture of the policy process by powerful groups, or exclusion of marginalized communities from benefits and or decision-making processes. And this is something that the Biden bills spent a lot of time trying to ensure did not happen. So we can see some of them in the CHIPS and Science Act. There are prohibitions against share buybacks and dividends by recipients of grant funds. And that was something that actually enacting that, operationalizing that was a real challenge for the CHIPS for America office. And we can talk about later how they did that if anybody's interested. But also there's a requirement that recipients of funds share a portion of the gains above what they're forecasting their gains would be with the government to keep them from capturing excess profits from these funds. And the vehicle for enacting these things is grant conditionality. So when people are accepting grants, they have to have a plan to make sure that these things are happening. And the same with the Inflation Reduction Act, as I mentioned, that benefits are being targeted to low-income disadvantaged communities and traditional energy communities. And there are also requirements that for paying prevailing wage and workforce development requirements. And these are all happening through grant and tax credit conditionality. So this, as I said, the accountability mechanisms are going to be important for progressive market crafting programs that we're trying to enact in a market configuration that's been conditioned by neoliberal policy programs, by neoliberal policies. In addition, a strong mission is important for progressive policy programs. These two things work together. The strong mission that helps to cultivate and maintain support for the program, acting with accountability measures to ensure that the policy is remaining on track. The mission and accountability are particularly important for progressive policies. So that's just a sort of quick review, not so quick review of the components of market crafting programs. And we can now turn back to this question of assessing the Biden programs. Are they good policy? Will they work? Are they post-neoliberal? And I want to look at some of the criticisms of the programs as a way of teasing out what's going on. I'm mostly going to deal with what I'm calling here sympathetic criticisms, but I just want to mention quickly, by unsympathetic here, I mean criticisms coming from people who maybe think that the whole thing is a bad idea. And some of the reasons for that are this is just the government picking winners, or that there's a sort of, especially things like the CHIPS and Science Act represent a nationalistic approach to economic policy that risks beggar thy neighbor or even active conflict. And also criticism that similar to the sort of the original TINA criticism, that this will result in nothing but government bloat and inflation and distortion of markets. I'll have a little bit to say about the inflationary one, but I want to turn to the sympathetic criticisms here, which I'm calling the everything bagel policy and de-risking. These come from two specific sources. Ezra Klein wrote an article for the New York Times that we're coining the term everything bagel liberalism, and the de-risking criticism has come from several sources, but most notably from Daniela Gabor, an economist at the University of West England. The everything bagel critique is essentially that loading policy programs with requirements related to social and economic justice undermines the program's effectiveness and leads to bad outcomes. Bad outcomes, the programs will be ineffective because capital can just exercise exit, or they can exercise their voice and try to get these things watered down so that they disappear in effect. And these kinds of measures are counterproductive, this critique goes, because you'll just end up getting less of the core policy output at a higher cost. So for example, in the CHIPS Act, there are project labor agreement and workforce development and support provisions that have been a source of a lot of complaint by some of the companies that might be targets of this funding. And this is in my view, a very important criticism for progressives and for the Biden administration to take into account. And the central challenge they're facing here is that they're operating through markets that have been crafted in the neoliberal image. And so they are trying to address difficulties in that market configuration that are systemic, but trying to address them at programmatic levels. And it's important for the Biden administration and policymakers going forward to be thinking about matching objectives and tactics to this extent that there are systemic problems. If there can be systemic solutions to them rather than freighting the programs with the need to try to address them on a case-by-case basis, that would be better. On the other hand, this is no easy task. Systemic change takes a long time if it happens at all. So I'm quite sympathetic to policymakers who have to balance these things. But it's a criticism that needs to be taken seriously, I think. The de-risking critique is essentially that these programs just amount to public subsidization of private downside risk, or more simply, bribing private capital to support selected policy priorities. And the concern is that ultimately this is just putting money in the hands of private capital and letting them decide what to do with it, hoping that they'll do what we want them to do with it, but what if they change their mind? And anyway, you might be supporting a core goal with this. You might be able to get private capital to deliver on certain things, but at the expense of undermining other progressive goals by leaving the process of how this is delivered entirely up to capital. So again, this is it. I think this is just as with the everything bagel critique, it's a perfectly valid critique, and it's something important that progressive policymakers need to take into account. And again, it comes from having to work through a market configuration that is already kind of working against you. We could think of this, especially in de-risking contexts, as the shareholder primacy problem, that corporations have come to be designed to be focused more on value extraction, disgorging their cash to shareholders over value creation, making sure that the profits of the company are reinvested. So accountability measures, like the kind we've been talking about, the prohibiting share buybacks and things like that, that's a good first line of defense. But longer term, we need to think systemically. So I want to think a little bit about systemic measures. I'm going to have something more to say about the last three, but just quickly about the first two. If we had universal health insurance and universal childcare coverage, then obviously these programs wouldn't have to be trying to take care of that on a programmatic basis to ensure that these kinds of benefits are being offered by grant recipients and funding recipients. If we had increased labor power, then it wouldn't be up to policy programs to ensure that labor was treated fairly. So that's that. I won't say more about that. Obviously, a lot could be said about that. But I do want to think quickly about a few possible responses on a systemic level that might address some of these issues. So the first is an interesting and I think quite exciting proposal, originally from work by Robert Hockett and Saleh Omarova, and developed by Saleh Omarova, the plan for a national investment authority. And obviously there's lots to say about this, but I'll just try to say very quickly, the idea behind the National Investment Authority is to have a public financing mechanism so that there wouldn't be a need in all cases to be relying on the private investment infrastructure and needing to deal with trying to attract private infrastructure by basically de-risking it. National Investment Authority would be made up of two elements. One would be investment through debt investment. That's the National Infrastructure Bank. And then on the other side, you have an equity investment component. That is the National Capital Management Corporation. And I won't, let me just go briefly into this. There's more that I could say about this, but in the interest of time, what is it? What could this offer? Why would this be important? The National Infrastructure Bank would be able to create a new low-cost financing channel for municipal infrastructure and project finance that would be consonant with national economic goals, because the financing would be coming from a public entity. And I didn't go into the details of the design of the National Investment Bank, a National Infrastructure Bank, but it has a lot of public accountability built into it. And so having this new low-cost financing channel where the finance is coming from an entity, a public entity, would be important, because currently infrastructure projects from municipalities struggle to find financing at attractive rates because they might not be able to guarantee sufficient returns. And this being able to turn to a National Infrastructure Bank rather than having to try to either figure out ways to bribe private investors to convince them to come in, or to just not do the infrastructure investment, leave that infrastructure building to private markets, and then maybe it develops in a way that is not serving all of the people, or doing it in a way that you would rather not. Having this public option would be very helpful in that regard, and would cut down on the amount of de-risking of private investment that has to be done. It also has the advantage of combining the benefits of centralization and decentralization. The National Infrastructure Bank would have a regional component, just like with the Federal Reserve banks, so that there would be a lot of local input into how these things got directed. And on the other side of it, National Capital Management Corporation, yeah, it's worth spending a couple of minutes on this, even though I don't have that much more time. The bottom 5 minutes, okay, yeah. The bottom line with the National Capital Management Corporation is that it would be public equity investment. The advantage of the public equity investment is that it would allow more direct public control of the investment dollars that are going into these projects, literally the equity control component. It also has a component that would provide a public option for managing bailouts, so that we wouldn't have to turn to BlackRock to manage our bailouts. We could do it with a public equity manager that would then be able to impose conditions that would be more in the public interest. So more to say about that, but this is coming from this report put out by the Berggruen Institute, and it's great, and I highly recommend it. In terms of corporate governance reform, one way to address the problem of the shareholder primacy model would be through corporate law reform that discourages or prohibits some of the value extractive strategies and encourages value creation strategies. And in 2018, Elizabeth Warren introduced the Accountable Capitalism Act that attempts to do this. It has a lot of measures that would get directly at this, and just a few highlights that it would institute a federal charter for corporations and require large corporations to obtain a federal charter rather than incorporating at the state level. And that would give, more centralized control over what could be required of those corporations in order to qualify for that charter. So it would be all the publicly minded things, obligating them to consider the interests of all corporate stakeholders. It would also put restrictions on sales of company shares by directors or officers, so you could have more direct control over some of the things that go on with share buybacks. In any event, it's sort of a good government reform for corporate law. And obviously, this is a difficult sell politically. There's a reason why it's something she introduced and not a law at this point. But it is important as a marker if we want to talk about what could make a difference. What, if we could do it, might lead to something that would address some of these de-risking criticisms. Well, something like this might, and it's a good jumping off point for discussion. And just a word on the challenge of inflation. We have learned some important lessons from watching inflation evolve over the COVID and post-COVID period. One of the lessons that we learned was relearning the importance of supply-driven inflation. A lot of the inflation that we saw has begun to subside. There are lots of different reasons for that, but certainly part of it is developments on the supply side, bottlenecks working their way out, and investments that were geared toward loosening up some of those the supply chain issues. And this has led to recovering a sort of older economics tradition, a tradition that would be associated with economists like Vasily Leontief and Lawrence Klein, that was more focused on sectoral analysis and supply side analysis, and thinking about the macroeconomy in terms of input-output models and understanding how the different sectors of the economy work together to really have a map of how inflation is going to propagate through the economy, so that we can understand better how to cope with it. That was eclipsed in the 70s and 80s. Both on the left by Keynesianism, which was focused more on an aggregate analysis, and on the right by monetarism, the idea that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. But thankfully, a newer generation of economists is taking this up again. Isabella Weber is doing great work on this at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and Employ America, a think tank in New York, is doing fabulous work on this too. So those are important lessons to learn. And as we think about market crafting programs that might have inflationary issues that we're concerned about, it's important to be thinking to be taking this richer understanding of inflation and how it propagates that problem. So wrapping up, coming back to this question of are we seeing something new? Is Bidenomics post-neoliberal? And I wanted to just mention there's a recent interview with Quinn Slobodian, the author of Globalists, a great book about neoliberalism. He was asked why neoliberalism which really was a marginal position at its inception, almost an underdog, why it was able to succeed so spectacularly. And his answer was this: mainly because the people that they were catering to were the people with the most wealth and the most influence. If you try to produce a global galaxy of real underdogs and the people who have ideas that run counter to the ideas of the commodification of life, you will most likely just end up with a bunch of people in prison. And he's putting it starkly, but I think there is surely an important point here for progressive market crafters. What's different about the Biden bills is not that the state is taking action in markets with significant political and distributional consequences. What is different, maybe, is that if faithfully executed, the market crafting programs seek to alter the landscape of markets in a manner that upends some of the beneficial contours that capital has grown used to. And that's difficult. And especially because the programs are seeking to circumvent some of capital's advantages while leaving other fundamental advantages in place. So that's always going to be a challenge. So in conclusion, I think the Biden programs are at least suggestive of a post-neoliberal approach. We have to recognize that individual markets are complex public-private institutional landscapes, but that there are really no individual markets. All markets are part of the market system, and the market crafting programs will work best when they're part of an integrated systemic market crafting approach. So that's all I have today. Thank you for your attention.
And now, discussant Steve Vogel. Thanks.
Thank you. Not too surprisingly, I agree with just about everything Peter said. I really like the way that he kind of systematically went through what the Biden administration is doing, what's new, what's not new. And I also love the way that he addressed, some of the core analytical issues of, mission, implementation, and accountability. And it was really great to hear the talk, because I've read the paper, but the talk was actually quite different from the paper and added some new insights, which I enjoyed thinking about and kind of scribbled and changed my notes while I was going. So substantively, in my book, I focus, I think, much more narrowly on what you might call market governance. So that would be corporate governance, financial regulation, labor regulation, antitrust, intellectual property rights, et cetera, et cetera. In both the report and also in the talk, you're talking about a much broader range of policies. I have absolutely no objection to that, but I do think that and in fact, I think that's probably the right way to go, in the sense of, if you think of market craft as policies that try to shape markets for a particular policy goal, then just kind of logically that leads you to everything. So I don't have an objection. I just think that if we're going to expand the substantive scope, then maybe kind of analytically, one possible thing might be to kind of break it down into its pieces. What I mean is, think about like a typology. So what, and I don't have any set number, but I'm just going to throw out a 5-piece typology for the sake of discussion. So it could go market governance, which is basically what I cover in Marketcraft, which you might think of as economic regulation. There, the government is like the architect of the market rules, right? Second would be public investment. There, the government is the financier, right? Third is the public option, where the government is now a participant. Fourth is procurement, government as customer. And fifth would be coordination, government as planner, or maybe even sometimes matchmaker. And so what's the point of all that? Hopefully it's not just because academics love typologies, but I would suggest that might be useful, in that you could graft it onto your ideas about mission and implementation and accountability. And you might think that different items within this typology oriented towards different missions and have different implementation and accountability challenges. Now, I won't drag you back through all five, but let's just do two. Right. So the first one, the mission of regulation is often, at least in terms of the, whatever legislative remit is relatively narrow, right? You're supposed to regulate electricity prices or whatever, right? And so one of the, I think, and I'll come back to this, but one of the pieces of the Marketcraft agenda is, should that fairly narrow mandate be expanded to other things, right? Whereas public investment is very different. I mean, the mission often is grand, right? It's some big, broad policy. So they're kind of like inherently qualitatively different, I'm suggesting. And also they might be different in terms of the other things you talked about, right? So the challenge, for instance, for doing Marketcraft through regulation would be, how do you get an independent regulator to care about other things, right? I mean, particularly if the law says you should only care about this, right? And in public investment, the challenge is very different, right? Where if we're talking now about Congress, maybe Congress working with a particular executive branch, right? Where it's inherently political, and so the challenge is less to try to broaden like a narrow mandate, but rather political capture and kind of protecting it from just being overwhelmed by politics. Anyway, could go on about that, but I won't. Yeah, I guess that's the main comment I wanted to make. Then, I've got a question which, kind of relates to what I was saying a moment ago about, narrowness versus broader mandates. But in thinking about what's new in the Biden administration, like I said, I agree with everything you said, but I wanted to throw in one other possibility, which is, and maybe this is more potential than real, and so I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how far they've gone, but would be precisely the idea of taking these fairly narrow market governance regulatory issues and steering them towards broader agendas, right? So just to be concrete, let's start with antitrust, right? One of the big battles that's going on right now is trying to redefine antitrust, the goals of antitrust, away from like a narrow focus on consumer welfare to something broader, like what are the impacts of antitrust policy for labor, right? Or even broader, what are the implications of antitrust policy for democracy? And obviously there's going to be a big debate about whether that's at all appropriate. But there's a potential novelty, or antitrust maybe is one area where the Biden administration has gone the furthest, where they are kind of like expanding what it's all about. A second would be labor, where you're kind of rethinking labor regulation as not just labor protection, but as like actively trying to move the power needle, right? In other words, to shift power from capital labor. And I mean, you suggested that. So I'm not saying you haven't thought of that. I'm just kind of curious how far you think the Biden administration has gone in actually doing that. And then there were only going to be two, but then you mentioned a third, which is corporate governance, where again, that's an area where regulation could be redefined, right? From a fairly, narrow mandate of, like whatever, appropriate disclosure, proper procedures, to again, affecting like the balance of power within corporations and within society more broadly. So I guess I was just asking you, what your assessment is, how far the Biden administration has gone. Is that something new? And will it go further?
Thank you. Really great, thought-provoking comments and questions. I really like that typology a lot. I know in previous comments you had given, you said some of that, but this is even more, and this is really super interesting. Thank you for that. As far as the question of how far do I think the Biden administration has come on this, I feel like it's very difficult to assess. I think that they've put in place, they've taken some initial steps that have created the possibility for momentum. The question now is to what extent for me, I think, is to what extent does the administration remain engaged in pushing those things forward? Because I think at every step, entities that are going to be resistant to some of these changes will push back. And so the question is, will there be a sustained effort? And I'm a little bit concerned. I don't have any inside knowledge about this, but I'm a little bit concerned about some of the staff changes that I think they had a remarkable group of people. I didn't know this beforehand, but looking at what they've accomplished, which I think is really remarkable. And then there were a lot of people left, which is normal after a couple of years. That happens a lot. The chief of staff has changed. People in the in the NEC have changed. So I guess that my answer to the question is, I think that they have taken the right first steps. And in that way, they have really moved the needle on some things that I was not expecting needles to be moved on. But the question is, what kind of pushback do we have? And does the new staff have the same ideas, and are they going to be persistent in that? I don't know. I'd be very curious to hear what other people think.
Michael Reich, and I started the political economy program in the economics department many decades ago here. I wanted to push farther on what Steve Vogel was saying about how far has the Biden administration gone in changing, making the economy more inclusive and have more equitable growth. It's certainly gone a long way on the growth side. But it might be, I think it might take a second Biden administration with a different congressional, makeup to get there. And that's not surprising. The Reagan administration didn't really solidify a lot of its positions until it was the second Reagan administration, like the 1986 tax cut. And, but, because I was listening to you and I was thinking, well, okay, but how are these going to change inequality in the United States? If you build a lot of bridges and tunnels, or you build a new rail tunnel under the Hudson and so on, that makes the country grow more than it would otherwise. That's fine. But it doesn't necessarily change the very unequal distribution of income that we've arrived at. And the examples that you gave in the legislation, I thought there would be more of them, I guess. Like you mentioned, I think, prevailing wages and workforce development. We already have a lot of workforce development in this country. It's not terribly effective. But anyway, so the National Labor Relations Board is doing more. They're on the labor side. There's potential, but I think these three bills were all part of a bipartisan compromise, which didn't necessarily attack these root issues at all.
I totally agree with that. And I think that these programs could be very helpful in delivering in an equitable way on some national goals if the broader economic infrastructure were differently configured. But I think the point that you're making about that this doesn't really address inequality, and that the measures that are in place in the individual programs, which I think are, some of them are very helpful. I think it's useful that both in the citing of a lot of the manufacturing, both in CHIPS and in IRA, that they're looking to put in disadvantaged communities, and also there's $27 billion in the investment in the Inflation Reduction Act for greenhouse gas reduction fund, that a portion of it has to be used for helping disadvantaged communities. And there are things in there that are on the right track, but it's pushing against so much. And so I think that things like the developments in labor activism, I'm just thinking about things, what are the systemic things that could actually make the pathways through all of these resources are funding better set up to distribute things better. So I think the short answer to the question is these programs are definitely not enough to address those systemic things. it would take systemic reforms to make programs like this be able to achieve what they really want to achieve.
One hope is that that they thread the needle. So like citing some of these new factories in under disadvantaged or deindustrialized red states the hope is that it might bring unions and change the labor politics in places like Ohio and Georgia. Agreed. But that's really, we're only going to, I think to your point, we're only going to see the fruits of that in the second administration if it comes to that. It's going to take a while to shift political affiliation. But that was one explicit note. Yes, sir.
David Height, I'm a tech entrepreneur who's doing some work on AI with another section. But I would challenge one piece. The market crafting work, as Steve knows, is hugely important if you're in industry to understand how this works. I would challenge one small piece you had up there, which is market crafting doesn't include industry; it includes the government. And then there's a gap. You have a line in that chart on new institutions. The single most, it is to be trying to a quick quip on it. It really is, why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. And if you were to put in a section, the number one issue on chips, and the good news is on chips. Let's focus on chips. On trade wars on chips for years, and it was the predecessor to this industrial policy. So and yes, go Cal. The person on PCAST, the President's Council on Science and Technology, is Andrea Goldsmith, who is Cal all the way through her PhD and postdoc. So go Cal. But the key piece I would add in there is that market crafting is, and this is not I'm not arguing for the neoliberal approach. Market crafting has to include the relationship between the holders of title to capital and the rest, and the programs that the government is doing additive. If you were to add that piece in there, what you're enabled to do is capture and get that voice heard. Because the number one problem in Washington, and I worked all sides of this as a tech entrepreneur, is how do I get the industry guys not to shout and scream at me, and at least coalesce into some sort of coalition. If you add that in there, I think you'll be filling in what Steve's book covers, is that whole idea that the industry associations, for example, are hugely important for consolidating demand. So sorry for that's a challenge, not a question, but
point very well taken. And I think I agree. I agree with that. I think to the extent that what I was presenting was in opposition to that, it was a poor choice of words on my part. I think you're absolutely right that the market is a creation of private actors, of government, of industry groups, and obviously different markets have different contours. And there are some markets, like semiconductor markets, where the idea of public-private partnership is really taken to another level. So thank you for that point. Very well taken. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more. Maybe let's bundle them. Yeah, let's take there in the back. I think with gentleman with the cow hat, and then we'll take it over here. I think there's one.
First, let me say go Bears. Second, and I'll make this quick. I just want to focus on the piece about targeting political outcomes, because it seems like a lot of this sort of industrial policymaking discussion implicitly entangle some notion of targeting political outcomes, especially an implicit, sometimes explicit hope that all the people that you are benefiting, whether that's capital, firms, or labor, will continue to support not only the policies that directly benefit them, but also all these ancillary policies having to do with social policy, workforce policy, environmental policy, and et cetera. And, I gotta say, I have my doubts. Right. Like, I kind of feel like these people are going to take the bag and run, and not necessarily come back to the table, support the Biden administration in the next election, vote Democratic, whatever sort of, miracle fantasy you want to believe in. And so I'm just want to know, like, how are you and your colleagues thinking about how we should actually target political outcomes in order to achieve this sort of stable, long lasting political coalitions that a lot of these policies are seeking to achieve?
Another question over here. Did I see? There, yeah, Jay.
Hi, I'm Jay Varela. I'm a PhD student in political science. And yeah, I guess that my question kind of builds on the last one. So I saw you had Peter Evans's book up there, and I've been meaning to go back and read that again, because I think the concept of embedded autonomy is interesting, because he's talking about you need the autonomy to be able to craft these solutions and sort of like operationalize them and, you know, roll them out and all of that. But also a condition of that autonomy is also embeddedness within society. And it strikes me that in terms of building like a durable political coalition for this, that what's going on with like, you know, this effort to kind of like tout Bidenomics as a success, it seems like it's falling flat. And I think one of the reasons for that is in the past year, we've seen, what is it? So the same day that, you know, one headline is Bidenomics being discussed, the other one is child poverty just doubled. And that's because, you know, we're trying to tout these policies at the same time another set of policies are expiring from like pandemic era stimulus. I think there's potentially a lesson in that, because, you know, I think the Republican Party is selling something pretty clear, or selling a lot of things that are very kind of visceral and that people can feel. And the Democratic Party, it's like, you know, maybe semiconductor chips are a bit removed. But, you know, if it's integrated within a larger framework of like societal transformation and redevelopment and all of that, it seems like that can be more successful. And just very quickly, I would also ask the question, I wanted to put on the table the issue that a lot of the folks you were citing, you know, and there's a lot of ferment going on these issues, but a lot of it seems concentrated kind of along the Acela corridor, as they call it, from DC to Boston. And we're here in California, and certainly there are people from California in that mix. But my question is, how do we broaden that? Because, you know, like economists talk about the problem or celebrate the phenomenon of the floating craps table, where like a certain small set of people are always getting invited and others are not. But like, you know, we talked about this problem, like I think David was talking about this, that there just aren't enough, or we need more people ready to go into these roles. And I think, you know, those people, you know, so I think figuring out a way to sort of build kind of like an intellectual movement and intellectual kind of linkages across the country, I think would be useful. So I just wanted to put that on the table. But thanks.
So final word, both Peter and Steve too. We'd love to hear any concluding thoughts you guys have.
Yeah, all those comments are really interesting. I think the thinking about how to deliver on things so that people will actually support you. Do we have a plan for this? I think all the comments are sort of related to each other, because the question is, what is the Democratic Party offering to people as a vision of moving to a better economy? And that it's not enough to be offering isolated policy programs, as big as they are and as transformational as they may be in some sense, that aren't connected to anything, that aren't connected to a vision that people can see that the Democratic Party is fighting for to advance on all fronts. I think that's a huge problem. I agree with you. And I think that the issue of broadening the bench and trying to appeal to the broader audience, I think that the idea of building a broader movement, taking the time to do that, it's going to take time. That's something that should have started years and years and years ago. But if it didn't start years and years ago, it has to start now. And I think that these early years of the Biden administration should have been, I think they were for me, I feel like should have been very inspirational to people who are concerned about these things. Something was happening, but like it's an ember, it can go out very easily. And so thinking about how to do that outreach and how to build these things, how to have a message that really is not just about semiconductors, is not just about particular accountability mechanisms, but one that connects up to all parts of people's lives so that they don't see these contradictions and think, you know, well, you said Bidenomics is delivering this, but then child poverty is doubling. That's the challenge. So I don't have an answer, but I'm just sort of agreeing with you vigorously. That's the challenge. So thank you for those comments.
I don't really have much to add to that. I guess I just throw out that the Biden administration seems to, at the very least, not be making some of the mistakes that recent either Democratic administrations or Democratic candidates have made in terms of at least appearing to appeal to elites and not to, regular people, or just appeal to the coasts and not to certain regions. So, there's improvement and potential there, but the big question that everybody's raising is still there. Is like, why isn't this resonating more than it does? And I don't have a good answer for that one.
No, final note. I think we admire the problem more clearly. So for that, thanks both to Peter and to Steve.